The following story is a narrative reconstruction built from hypotheses, rumors, and verses that have never been officially confirmed. They say the man collapsed just beyond the porch light, not fully in the dark, not fully safe. According to fragmented retellings, the couple almost didn't hear him. The night was quiet in the way nights often are when nothing is supposed to happen. No traffic, no voices. Just the faint, ordinary sounds of a home settling into sleep. Then came the knock. Not firm, not urgent. A sound closer to weight than motion. When the door opened, what they saw did not look like a threat. The man was bleeding, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded panic. A torn sleeve, a dark stain spreading slowly, as if unsure whether it belonged there. His face carried exhaustion rather than fear. Some versions say he asked for help. Others insist he didn't speak at all, only leaned forward as if gravity had finally decided for him. The couple hesitated. People hesitate for reasons they rarely admit later. Instinct, courtesy, the quiet belief that bad things announce themselves clearly. They brought him inside. The light revealed more than the darkness had. Bruises that didn't match the story his body seemed to tell. Cuts that looked less accidental than they first appeared. Still, nothing about him suggested violence. He was calm. Too calm, some say. As they cleaned the wound, as they offered water, as they asked questions, he answered vaguely. Something about the situation felt incomplete. Not wrong exactly, just unfinished. What no one disputes is this. At some point that night, the couple realized the man was not afraid of being found. He was afraid of being sent away. And long before anyone understood why, that fear began to feel deliberate. Because the man they had sheltered was not running from danger. He had already left it behind, and the house, warm, quiet, ordinary, had unknowingly become the next place where his story would continue. Not as a refuge, but as a reckoning that would unfold slowly, from the inside out. Stories like this rarely survive intact. They fracture early, shaped by whispers, reinterpretations, and the uncomfortable need to explain how something unthinkable entered an ordinary home. According to those who speak of it carefully, the couple believed they were making a simple decision, a human one, help offered without calculation, shaped by empathy rather than suspicion. They did not see themselves as rescuers. They saw themselves as temporary shelter. That distinction matters. Shelter implies neutrality. It implies safety without commitment. What they did not know, what no version of this story claims they could have known, is that neutrality had already vanished the moment the man crossed the threshold. The injured stranger did not behave like someone in shock. He did not flinch when voices rose. He did not scan the room for exits. Instead, he settled in with a quiet familiarity that unsettled only in hindsight. Some say he watched too closely. Others say he barely watched at all. What feels consistent is the sense that he was waiting, not for help, but for something else. An outcome. A pause. A space where the noise inside him could finally stop echoing. If you choose to stay with this story, consider subscribing, not as a gesture, but as a continuation of these intimate narratives where danger arrives quietly, disguised as need. And if you feel inclined, leave a comment about where you're listening from. These stories carry different weight, depending on the distance between teller and listener. What follows is not an investigation. It is a narrative told over time, shaped by proximity, rather than proof. A story about how trust can be misplaced without being foolish, and how the most devastating betrayals rarely announce themselves with urgency. Sometimes they arrive injured, sometimes they arrive silent, and sometimes by the time the truth surfaces, it is already living under the same roof. The first night passed without incident, at least in the way incidents are usually defined. No shouting, no sudden violence, no moment that could later be pointed to as the beginning. According to versions told long after, the man slept deeply. Not the restless sleep of someone afraid of being caught, but something heavier, dense, as if exhaustion had finally overtaken vigilance. The couple took turns checking on him, listening for signs of pain or movement that might require attention. They noticed how still he was. Too still, some would later say. His breathing was slow and even, untroubled by dreams. This detail returns often in retellings, not because it proves anything, but because it felt incongruent. People in distress usually carry that distress into sleep. He did not. In the quiet hours, the couple spoke in low voices. They wondered aloud whether they should have asked more questions, whether they should have contacted someone, whether helping without context was reckless or simply humane. They decided to wait until morning. Morning brings clarity. Morning brings explanations. That belief has comforted many people in retrospect. When the man woke, he was polite, grateful even. He thanked them without urgency, without embarrassment. His voice was steady. His eyes did not dart. According to some accounts, he asked where he was, though the question sounded more procedural than confused. The injury appeared manageable. Painful, but not life-threatening. He allowed them to tend to it without resistance. When they asked how it happened, his answer was vague but plausible. An accident, a fall, a moment of bad judgment. Details blurred. This blurring should have mattered more than it did. What unsettled the couple was not what he said, but what he did not ask. He showed no curiosity about the outside world, no concern about who might be looking for him, no urgency to leave. He accepted their hospitality as if it were temporary but expected, as though this was not the first time he had relied on the silence of strangers. Throughout the day, the house adjusted around him. Chairs moved, doors opened and closed more softly. Conversations shifted tone. This adjustment happened unconsciously, a response to the presence of someone who did not quite belong, but did not disrupt either. That in-between state created its own tension. There are accounts suggesting the man wandered the house lightly, never touching personal items, never intruding. He did not explore, he did not settle. He existed in the space between guest and fixture, occupying rooms without claiming them. This restraint was noted later as unusual. People who need help often take up space in obvious ways. People who intend to stay temporarily often overcompensate with politeness. He did neither. At some point, one of the couple noticed something small, a smear of dried blood near the cuff of his other sleeve. Not from his injury. Different in color, older. When asked about it, he glanced down briefly, then shrugged it off. "Probably mine," he said. The answer ended the question without resolving it. That evening, the mood shifted subtly. Nothing had changed outwardly, yet the house felt less neutral, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The couple found themselves watching the man more closely, noticing how his gaze lingered during conversation. Not intense, not predatory, but measuring. Measuring implies comparison. Comparison implies reference. What was he comparing them to? Dinner was quiet. The man ate slowly, methodically. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He ate like someone who had eaten before under similar conditions. This detail is repeated often, perhaps because it later felt symbolic. Comfort with routine implies repetition. After the meal, the man asked a question that many versions highlight. "How long have you lived here?" The question itself was harmless. The way it was asked was not. According to retellings, it carried no curiosity, only calibration, as if he were placing the house in a sequence of places rather than imagining a future in it. That night, the couple slept lightly. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. The presence of another person in a home changes its rhythm. Sounds shift meaning. Silence stretches. Sometime in the early hours, one of them woke, convinced they had heard movement. When they checked, the man was where he was supposed to be. Awake, perhaps, or pretending to be asleep. No one can say. What can be said is that the couple began to sense, without evidence, that the man's injury was not the most dangerous thing he carried with him. Danger does not always announce itself through aggression. Sometimes it arrives composed, contained, waiting. By the end of the first night, nothing terrible had happened, and yet something irreversible had begun. The couple had crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, not into violence, but into proximity. They had allowed a stranger into the private architecture of their lives, and whatever the man had done before, collapsing beyond the porch light, it had not stayed outside with him. It had come inside, quietly, and it was learning the shape of the house. The second day began with an ordinary sound: water running. One of the couple noticed it from the kitchen, too steady, too unhurried. The man had woken early and moved through the house without asking where things were. He did not fumble with doors. He did not search for switches. He behaved like someone navigating a place he had already mapped in his head. This detail would matter later. At the time, it registered only as mild unease. When he emerged, clean and composed, the injury looked better than expected. Less swollen, less painful. He thanked them again, using their names this time. Some versions suggest he had asked for them earlier and remembered. Others insist he picked them up from casual conversation. Either way, familiarity arrived quickly. Too quickly. Throughout the morning, the man spoke little. When he did, his words were measured, neutral, almost considerate. He did not offer stories unless prompted, and when prompted, he deflected gently. Answers were short, incomplete, yet confident enough to discourage follow-up. Confidence without detail creates imbalance. It puts the burden of curiosity on the listener. At some point, one of the couple noticed the man watching the hallway, specifically the closed door at the end of it. A private space, a boundary. His gaze lingered there longer than anywhere else in the house. When asked what he was looking at, he smiled faintly. "Just noticing how quiet it is," he said. Quiet, in that moment, felt fragile. As the day progressed, the couple debated, carefully, indirectly, what to do next. Should they encourage him to leave? Should they insist on contacting someone? Should they let him stay one more night? They never discussed the most uncomfortable possibility, that asking him to leave might provoke something. This thought remained unspoken, but it shaped every decision. The man did not press to stay. He did not ask for favors. He simply existed in the space they had given him, making himself difficult to justify removing. That evening, something changed. The couple noticed a smell in the bathroom, faint, metallic, inconsistent with the visible injury. When questioned, the man shrugged it off again. "Probably nothing," he said. His tone was not defensive, it was final. Finality can be more alarming than denial. Later, as dusk settled, one of the couple searched quietly online, not for the man directly, but for context, reports, rumors, fragmented stories. Nothing specific at first. Just a sense that something nearby had happened recently. Details were vague, unconfirmed, incomplete, but there was mention of a family. No names, no location details, only references to violence described obliquely, as if even the storytellers were unsure how much to say. The timing felt uncomfortably close. The couple did not share this immediately. Fear, when shared too early, becomes contagious. When shared too late, it becomes guilt. That night, the man spoke more than he had before. Not about himself, but about families. About how people misunderstand what binds them together. About how loyalty can turn corrosive when expectations are left unspoken. His tone was calm, reflective, almost academic. The couple listened, unsure whether they were being included in the conversation or evaluated by it. At one point, he said something that appears in nearly every retelling. "People think violence looks like anger," he said. "But most of the time, it looks like exhaustion." No one responded. Silence, in that moment, felt safer than agreement. Later, when the house had gone still again, the couple heard movement, slow footsteps crossing the hallway, a door opening, another closing, not forced, not rushed. When confronted gently the next morning, the man apologized. He claimed he had been disoriented, that the house still felt unfamiliar at night. The apology sounded rehearsed. The injury, now healing, seemed almost irrelevant compared to what had begun to surface. The man was not dangerous because he was hurt. He was dangerous because he was settled. At some point that day, the couple found something out of place, a towel missing, a chair moved, nothing significant enough to confront, just enough to confirm that the man was not simply passing through their lives. He was inhabiting them. The search online continued, deeper this time. Still no confirmation, still no certainty, but the pattern became clearer. A man injured, a family harmed, a timeline that overlapped too closely to ignore. The couple began to understand, not definitively but intuitively, that the man they had sheltered was not hiding from danger. He was hiding from aftermath, and aftermath, unlike pursuit, does not chase. It waits. By the end of the second night, the house no longer felt like a place of refuge. It felt like a witness. Walls absorb stories whether they are spoken or not. And the couple realized, with growing dread, that their home had begun to absorb his. Whatever had happened before he arrived was not finished. It had only paused long enough for him to find somewhere safe to sit with it. And now, surrounded by kindness he had not earned, the man seemed less injured and more complete. The third day unfolded under the weight of things not yet spoken. The couple woke early, not from noise, but from anticipation. Sleep had become shallow, punctuated by brief moments of alertness that felt disproportionate to the quiet house. The man was already awake again. He always was. According to later recollections, no one ever saw him wake up. He simply transitioned from stillness to activity without ceremony. That absence of transition unsettled them. He was sitting at the table when they entered the room, hands folded, posture relaxed, not waiting, occupying. He greeted them calmly, as if this had already become routine, as if mornings together were expected. They noticed how little he asked for. No food requests, no medication reminders, no questions about plans. People in need usually negotiate their presence. He did not. Throughout the morning, the couple moved through small, familiar tasks with heightened awareness. Every sound felt amplified. Every movement felt observed, though nothing in the man's behavior suggested overt scrutiny. He did not stare. He did not follow. He listened. Listening can be more invasive than watching. At one point, the man commented casually on the layout of the house, not a compliment, not criticism. Just an observation about how sound traveled through the hallway, how doors aligned in a way that allowed sightlines to overlap. The remark landed heavily. The couple exchanged a glance that said what neither wanted to voice. He has been paying attention. Later, while one of them stepped outside briefly, the other remained inside with the man. The conversation drifted into silence, then into something heavier. The man spoke again about families, this time less abstractly. He mentioned how conflicts don't begin with violence. They begin with routines, with small disappointments, with expectations that accumulate without release. He spoke as if narrating something he had observed, not experienced. Distance is a powerful disguise. The listener felt the urge to interrupt, to steer the conversation elsewhere. But interruption felt risky. Not because the man seemed volatile, but because he seemed composed. Composure can collapse suddenly when challenged. The talk ended without resolution. That afternoon, the couple finally shared what they had found online, the fragments, the rumors, the uneasy parallels. They spoke carefully, as if naming the fear too clearly might summon it. The man matched too many details: an injury, a disappearance, a family harmed behind closed doors. Nothing conclusive. But certainty was no longer required. The realization arrived quietly. They were not trying to confirm his guilt. They were trying to assess their safety. That distinction changed everything. From that moment on, every interaction became layered. Every word carried a double meaning. Kindness felt like camouflage. Hospitality felt like complicity. They did not know how to withdraw it without provoking consequence. As evening approached, the man appeared lighter, less reserved. He laughed softly at something trivial. The sound startled them. It was brief, controlled, and out of place. People who laugh after violence often do so carefully. Dinner passed with minimal conversation. The man thanked them again, this time adding, "You didn't have to help me." The statement was true and threatening. That night, one of the couple noticed something that hardened the fear into something colder. While tidying, they found a folded piece of fabric tucked behind the sink cabinet, dark, stiff, washed repeatedly, but not enough. They did not touch it. Touching would make it real. They returned it to where it had been, aware that the man would know it had been seen. Awareness in this house felt mutual now. Sleep came in fragments again. At some point, footsteps moved through the hallway, not aimless, directed. When the couple lay still, the steps stopped. Minutes passed. Then they continued. The next morning, the man announced casually that he would be leaving soon. Not today, soon. The word carried flexibility rather than commitment. It felt like something offered, not promised. Relief flickered, and was immediately replaced by suspicion. Leaving soon meant he had no intention of being rushed, and if he sensed urgency, he might respond unpredictably. The couple realized they had entered a negotiation they had never agreed to, one where kindness had given the other party leverage, where fear had to be managed quietly without provoking attention. They had taken in a stranger believing danger was loud. They were learning that danger can also be patient, and patience, when paired with intimacy, becomes control. By the end of that day, one thing was clear to them both. Whatever the man had done before arriving at their door, he was not finished deciding how his story would end. And until he did, they were no longer hosts. They were variables. Once the word soon entered the house, time changed texture. It no longer moved forward. It circled. The couple began measuring hours by the man's presence rather than by clocks. When he was in the room, time felt compressed. When he stepped away, it expanded too quickly, leaving space for thoughts they did not want to finish. He did not pack. This detail returned often in later tellings. The man spoke of leaving, but made no visible preparations, no gathering of belongings, no searching for shoes or bags. His injury, now clearly improving, no longer justified delay. And yet, he remained. Comfortably. That comfort was the most alarming part. According to fragmented recollections, the man became more conversational during this period. Not talkative, selective. He spoke when silence had stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable, inserting observations that sounded benign but landed with weight. He commented on how trust is built through repetition, how familiarity dulls caution, how people mistake kindness for safety. None of this was framed as advice. It was framed as observation. The couple responded carefully, offering neutral affirmations, avoiding disagreement. They were no longer trying to understand him. They were trying not to reveal themselves. Every reaction felt like data he might store away. At some point, one of them noticed the man no longer asked permission before moving through the house. He did not overstep in obvious ways. He simply behaved as if consent had already been granted. This shift was subtle and irreversible. That afternoon, the couple attempted to create distance without confrontation. Errands were suggested. Space was implied. The man declined politely, citing fatigue. His tone suggested appreciation rather than disappointment, which made refusal feel inappropriate. He stayed. While one of the couple stepped into another room, the other remained with him in the kitchen. The man stood quietly, watching hands move, dishes stack, water run. After a moment, he spoke. "You know," he said, "people always think the worst part is the act itself." The sentence was unfinished. The listener did not ask him to continue. "They don't realize," he added after a pause, "that it's the quiet afterward that does the real damage." Silence followed. That silence felt intentional. Later that evening, the couple discovered that one of the doors, always locked, had been unlocked. Nothing was missing, nothing disturbed. The message was not intrusion, it was access. The man did not mention it. That omission mattered. By now, the online fragments had coalesced into something more solid, still uncertain, still incomplete, but enough to confirm that a family had been killed, not by an intruder, not by accident, but by someone close enough to share their space. Details were obscured, names absent, locations blurred, but the pattern was unmistakable. The couple no longer wondered whether the man was responsible. They wondered whether he suspected they knew. That night, sleep did not come at all. The house felt alert, as if listening. Every sound carried intention. When the man moved, the couple tracked him by instinct rather than noise. They did not lock their door. Locking it would be a signal. At some point before dawn, one of them heard the man stop outside their room. No handle turned, no knock followed. He stood there long enough for the moment to register, then moved away. The next morning, he behaved as if nothing had happened. He spoke about weather, about recovery, about gratitude. This contrast, the normal layered over the unbearable, was what finally clarified the danger. The man was not unstable, he was controlled, and control is far more dangerous when threatened. The couple realized they could not force him to leave. They could only wait for an opening, an interruption, a reason that did not feel like rejection. They discussed options quietly, avoiding definitive language. The idea of involving others felt risky, not because they doubted the severity, but because they understood escalation might provoke the very thing they feared. The man had not acted violently here, yet. But violence does not always announce when it is finished. Sometimes it waits to see who notices. That afternoon, the man mentioned his family, not directly. He spoke of how people imagine love as something that restrains harm, how expectations can harden into resentment, how betrayal does not always come from outsiders. The couple listened, frozen. He did not confess. He did not deny. He spoke as someone describing weather patterns, detached, inevitable, already past. In that moment, the couple understood something essential. The man was not hiding what he had done. He was testing whether they could live alongside it, whether they could continue offering shelter once the truth pressed close enough to be felt. The house had become a threshold, not between safety and danger, but between acknowledgement and denial, and the man, now fully settled, seemed prepared to see which side they would choose. Because whatever had happened to his family had not ended with them. It had followed him. And now, quietly, it was asking to be allowed to stay. The fourth morning arrived without relief. Nothing had escalated overnight. No confrontation, no violence, and yet the absence of escalation felt deliberate rather than fortunate. According to later reconstructions, the couple sensed that restraint itself had become part of the dynamic, something the man controlled as carefully as his words. He woke later than usual that day. That alone felt significant. When he finally emerged, he moved more slowly, as if no longer concerned with appearances. The injury, nearly healed, no longer justified his continued presence, but he made no reference to leaving. Instead, he commented on the comfort of the house. The light, the way sound softened in the mornings. Comfort, once acknowledged, becomes a claim. The couple responded minimally. They had learned that engagement fed momentum. Silence, when measured carefully, created pause. They began to mirror his restraint, offering nothing extra, no warmth, no challenge, no reassurance. This mutual withholding thickened the atmosphere. At some point, the man asked a question that reframed everything. "Do you think people are responsible for what they become?" he said, "or just for what they choose in the moment?" The question was not philosophical. It was diagnostic. The couple answered cautiously. They spoke about complexity, about circumstances, about how no one is defined by a single act. Each word felt like it might later be replayed, examined for permission. The man listened closely. He nodded. "Exactly," he said. That agreement landed harder than disagreement would have. Throughout the day, the couple noticed that the man no longer avoided certain spaces. He lingered near doorways, paused in the hallway, stood close enough during conversation. That distance itself became noticeable. Proximity at this stage felt intentional. There are versions of the story that mention a particular detail. The man began aligning his routine with theirs, waking when they woke, eating when they ate, sitting where he could see both of them at once. This alignment reduced unpredictability, and unpredictability is often what keeps people safe. The couple realized they were no longer hosts managing a guest. They were participants in a pattern being slowly constructed around them. That afternoon, one of them attempted a subtle boundary, a suggestion that the man might be ready to continue his recovery elsewhere. The phrasing was gentle, supportive, almost apologetic. The man did not react immediately. He waited. Then he smiled, not warmly, not coldly, but with something that suggested understanding without agreement. "I don't want to cause trouble," he said. "I thought you knew that." The implication was clear. Trouble was a choice, and he was choosing not to make it, for now. The couple apologized, an instinctive response that later felt deeply unsettling. Apologizing rebalanced the power. It reframed their fear as discourtesy. That night, the house felt smaller than ever. The couple stayed awake longer than usual, listening. The man remained in the common space, not sleeping, not moving much, just present. A chair slightly angled, his attention unfocused, but not absent. At some point he spoke again, softly, almost to himself. "People always think it's the act that breaks things," he said. "But it's the waiting afterward. That's when you see who's really there." No one answered. Silence again was safer. Later, when the lights were off and the couple lay rigid in bed, they heard the chair move. Slow footsteps followed, not hurried, not hesitant. He stopped outside their door. This time, he knocked. Once, not loud, not demanding. The knock was an offer. After a long pause, one of the couple asked what he needed. "Nothing," he replied calmly. "Just checking what was left unsaid." He returned to his chair. That knock changed something fundamental. The boundary between guest and threat had thinned to almost nothing. The man had not crossed it, but he had touched it, and touching is often a test. The couple understood now that avoidance was no longer enough. The situation required resolution, but resolution carried risk. Forcing the issue might provoke violence. Allowing it to continue might invite something worse, normalization. Violence, when delayed, often seeks witnesses. By the end of that day, the couple reached a silent agreement. They would not confront him directly. They would create circumstances that required outside presence, something neutral, unavoidable, and non-accusatory. A repair, a visit, a reason. The plan was fragile, but it was all they had. The man, sensing perhaps a shift he could not fully identify, remained calm, too calm. His patience no longer felt passive, it felt practiced. Whatever he had done to his family, he had not lost control. He had refined it. And now, living inside a house built on kindness, he seemed to be deciding whether kindness would hold, or whether it would fracture the same way everything else in his life had. The couple did not know how the story would end. But they understood with chilling clarity that it would end inside this house, one way or another, and when it did, someone would be left carrying the weight of having let him in. The plan, once formed, began to shape everything. The couple did not speak of it directly again. Speaking would have made it fragile. Instead, they adjusted behavior in ways that could pass as coincidence. A phone call mentioned casually within earshot, a calendar consulted at the table, a remark about something needing attention soon. The man noticed. Of that there is little doubt. He did not comment on the changes, but his posture shifted subtly, less relaxed, more alert. The patience that once felt ambient now felt sharpened, as if waiting had become active rather than passive. Waiting, when deliberate, becomes surveillance. The couple sensed they were being measured, not for guilt, but for resolve. The man no longer seemed interested in whether they knew what he had done. That question, they suspected, had already been answered. What mattered now was how they would behave with that knowledge. Would they continue? Would they pretend? Would they act? Each option carried risk. That afternoon, one of the couple mentioned a routine visit expected soon. Nothing specific, just enough to suggest the house would not remain private indefinitely. The man's response was immediate and controlled. "Oh," he said, "I should probably go before I cause any inconvenience." The word probably did a great deal of work. Relief flickered, then stalled. The couple had learned not to trust momentum. The man had spoken of leaving before. Speech did not equal movement. Still, something felt different this time. He stood and began to move through the house, slowly, as if reacquainting himself with its details. He did not pack, but he gathered. A jacket, shoes placed neatly by the door, small, deliberate acts that resembled preparation without committing to departure. Preparation can be performative. The couple did not rush him. Rushing would look like urgency. Urgency would confirm fear. They continued their routines, aware that the smallest deviation might draw attention. As evening approached, the man paused near the doorway and looked around the room. "You have a good life," he said quietly. The statement was not complimentary. It was evaluative. One of the couple thanked him reflexively, then immediately regretted it. Gratitude felt misplaced in the presence of something so carefully controlled. The man nodded once, as if confirming a conclusion he had already reached. Dinner was brief and tense. The man ate less than usual. He seemed distracted, though not anxious. When he finished, he stood without ceremony and said he would leave early in the morning. Early is vague, but it was the closest he had come to commitment. That night, the couple slept in turns. One stayed awake while the other rested, listening to the house breathe. The man remained quiet. No footsteps, no movement. The silence felt intentional, as if he were granting them something or taking it. Just before dawn, one of the couple heard him move, not toward the door, but toward the kitchen. Drawers opened softly. Water ran, then stopped. When confronted gently, the man smiled. "Just getting ready," he said. Ready for what? He did not clarify. Morning arrived thin and pale. The man stood by the door, jacket on, injury fully concealed now. He thanked them again, this time with an emphasis that felt deliberate. "You didn't have to help me," he said. "Most people wouldn't have." The statement hung between them. Help, in this context, felt dangerously close to endorsement. As he reached for the handle, he paused. "There's one thing," he added. "You should know." The couple froze. Not from fear of confession, but from the awareness that whatever he chose to say was optional, that the truth was no longer necessary for control. He looked at them both, expression unreadable. "They were already broken," he said quietly, "long before I did anything." The wording was precise, responsibility displaced, violence reframed, guilt diluted. He opened the door. Cold air entered the house, sharp and cleansing. For a moment the couple believed it was over, that he would leave and become someone else's problem. That proximity alone had been the danger, and distance would undo it. He stepped onto the porch. Then he turned back. "You did the right thing," he said, "letting me in." The door closed behind him. The couple did not move. They waited. Minutes passed, then longer. Finally, one of them looked through the window. The man was gone. No sound of departure, no visible direction taken, only absence. Relief came in waves, followed immediately by something heavier. The realization that they had survived not because of action, but because of restraint, that the man had chosen to leave. Choice, in this story, remained the most unsettling element. They contacted others later, carefully, indirectly. They shared what they could without making claims, without accusing. By then, fragments of the truth had already surfaced elsewhere. A family had been killed, not by a stranger, by someone they trusted. The couple never spoke publicly. They did not seek validation. They did not want to be known as the people who almost hosted something worse, because what haunted them was not that they had helped a killer. It was that they had nearly normalized him. That kindness, when unexamined, had created space not for healing, but for continuation. The house eventually returned to routine, but routine felt thinner. Trust became something measured carefully, not withheld, but earned through time rather than instinct. The couple learned that evil does not always force entry. Sometimes it asks politely. Sometimes it arrives injured. And sometimes it waits to see how much of itself you are willing to live alongside before deciding whether to stay. In the days that followed his departure, the house resisted returning to itself. Not because anything was visibly damaged, not because objects had moved or memories demanded attention, but because absence, after prolonged presence, can feel louder than noise. According to later recollections, the couple found themselves listening for sounds that no longer occurred. Footsteps in the hallway, a chair shifting weight, the quiet rhythm of another person existing in shared space. These sensations lingered like after-images, triggered not by fear, but by habit. Habit is how danger disguises itself as normal. The first night alone, they slept poorly, not from anxiety alone, but from disorientation. The house felt larger, too open. Corners that once felt observed now felt exposed. It took time to remember that exposure no longer meant risk. Or so they hoped. They spoke little about what had happened. Naming it felt dangerous, as if language itself might invite something back. Instead, they focused on tasks, cleaning, rearranging, reclaiming spaces subtly altered by prolonged accommodation. The room where he had slept felt wrong, not tainted, occupied. They debated what to do with it. One suggested leaving it untouched, as if preserving the shape of events might prevent repetition. The other wanted to change everything, move furniture, repaint, deny the room its memory. They compromised, small changes, incremental, enough to feel movement without erasure. As the days passed, news fragments continued to surface, still incomplete, still careful, stories told in indirect language, emphasizing uncertainty rather than fact. A family gone, a man missing, details blurred deliberately, as if even those retelling it feared the weight of precision. The couple did not search for confirmation. Confirmation would require ownership. They understood now that certainty was not necessary to feel responsible. Responsibility in this case had arrived earlier. At the moment they chose not to ask too many questions. At the moment empathy overrode caution. At the moment kindness opened a door without conditions. They did not regret helping. This distinction mattered. Regret would imply they would choose differently next time. What they felt instead was recalibration, a subtle reshaping of instinct. They still believed in helping strangers, but now help came with structure, with boundaries spoken early rather than implied. They had learned that danger does not always resist care. Sometimes it accepts it eagerly. At some point during that week, one of the couple noticed something small that had been overlooked, a mark on the doorframe. faint, almost erased, too high to be accidental, too deliberate to be nothing. They stared at it for a long time, not because it proved anything, but because it suggested intention. The house, they realized, had not merely hosted a man, it had been studied. This realization did not produce panic, it produced distance. From that point on, the couple began to speak about what had happened, but carefully, not as a story to be told, but as a lesson to be integrated. They avoided dramatization, avoided moral conclusions. They spoke instead about patterns, about how violence often travels with narratives that justify it, about how perpetrators rehearse explanations long before they are needed, about how calm can be more alarming than chaos. They did not frame themselves as victims. That felt inaccurate. They had not been attacked, they had been tested. This framing haunted them more than violence would have, because testing implies evaluation, and evaluation implies choice. The man had chosen to leave, but he could just as easily have chosen not to. That freedom unsettled them. In quiet moments, they wondered whether something about them had influenced that choice. Their restraint, their refusal to confront, their careful neutrality, or whether the decision had been made long before he reached their door. These questions had no answers, and answers, they learned, were no longer the goal. Weeks passed. Life resumed its rhythm, though the rhythm felt altered. Conversations with others carried more pauses. Trust was offered more slowly, not withheld, but examined. The couple became more aware of how quickly narratives can soften reality. When friends spoke of crime, they noticed how often explanations leaned toward distance. Someone else, somewhere else, nothing like us. The couple did not correct them. Correction felt unnecessary. Proximity teaches lessons that explanation cannot. The house eventually stopped feeling occupied by memory. But it never returned to innocence. Innocence, they realized, is not restored once it has been complicated. It is replaced with awareness. This awareness did not make them cynical, it made them precise. They learned that kindness without boundaries invites interpretation, that silence can be read as permission, that offering shelter is not a neutral act, it creates a relationship, however brief. The man had left. But what he left behind was not fear. It was clarity. Clarity about how easily violence can pass through ordinary spaces without disrupting them. How easily it can sit at a table, eat dinner, and speak calmly about exhaustion. The couple never learned where the man went. They never sought to. Knowing would not undo what had happened. What mattered was that the house had become something else, not a crime scene, not a sanctuary, but a reminder. That danger does not always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives asking for help, and the cost of saying yes is not always paid immediately. Sometimes it is paid later, quietly, in how you listen, how you trust, and how carefully you learn to open the door again. The house stood unchanged, but the people inside it had learned something that would follow them far beyond its walls. Time did not soften what followed, it clarified it. In the weeks after the man's departure, the couple began to notice how often the story replayed itself, not as memory, but as interruption. A knock at a neighbor's door, a stranger asking for directions, an unexpected sound outside after dark. None of these moments were dangerous on their own, yet each one carried a brief hesitation that had not existed before. That hesitation was new. It lived between impulse and action. Before, they would have opened the door without thinking. Now, thought arrived first. Not fear, evaluation. A quiet internal pause where possibilities were weighed without being dramatized. This change disturbed them more than nightmares would have. Nightmares end. Recalibration does not. According to later reflections, the couple struggled most with the idea that nothing had happened to them in the way people expect harm to appear. There were no bruises, no broken objects, no definitive moment of escape. This made the experience difficult to explain even to themselves. They had not been attacked. They had been accommodated. That distinction mattered deeply. Violence, when visible, allows distance. You can point to it, name it, reject it. What they experienced resisted that clarity. It had unfolded through courtesy, patience, and the shared illusion of normalcy. The man had not demanded space. He had been given it. This realization reshaped how the couple understood responsibility. They did not blame themselves, but they no longer believed innocence was protection. Innocence, they learned, is not a shield. It is a state that assumes good faith will be reciprocated. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is studied. The couple began talking more openly, not about the man specifically, but about boundaries, about how quickly empathy can become exposure when it is not accompanied by structure. They noticed how often stories of harm begin not with cruelty, but with generosity that lacks containment. This insight did not harden them. It refined them. They still believed in helping others. They simply learned that help must be shaped deliberately, not offered blindly. That safety is not the absence of trust, but the presence of limits. One evening, while reorganizing a closet, one of the couple found something overlooked before, a small object, ordinary, forgettable, something the man could have taken but didn't. Its presence was unsettling, not because it was threatening, but because it suggested intention. He had chosen what to leave behind. Leaving nothing would have erased him more cleanly. Leaving something meant memory. They disposed of it without ceremony, not because it frightened them, but because it did not belong. In the months that followed, fragments of the larger story surfaced more clearly, still never complete, still told in careful language. A family killed behind closed doors, a man who had vanished between places, leaving only speculation in his wake. The couple never confirmed details. Confirmation felt unnecessary. They recognized patterns now. The language used to soften violence, the way explanations drifted toward inevitability rather than choice, the way people spoke of exhaustion as if it were an excuse rather than a warning. What unsettled them most was how familiar those explanations sounded. They had heard them in their own kitchen, at their own table, in their own house. This awareness lingered quietly, shaping how they listened to others. When someone spoke calmly about anger, they paid attention. When someone framed harm as something that simply happened, they noted the absence of responsibility. They learned to listen not just to words, but to structure. Who was centered, who was displaced, who was excused. This listening did not make them suspicious of everyone. It made them attentive. Over time, the house began to feel like home again, but not in the way it once had. It felt earned, maintained, actively inhabited rather than assumed. Doors were still open to others, but with questions asked early and expectations stated clearly. Boundaries, they discovered, did not reduce kindness. They preserved it. The couple never spoke publicly about what they experienced, not out of shame, but out of restraint. Turning it into a story felt like it would grant the man something he did not deserve, narrative ownership. Instead, they carried the experience privately, allowing it to inform rather than define them. The most unsettling truth they carried was this: the man had not deceived them. He had revealed himself gradually, through comfort, patience, and calm. The danger had not been hidden. It had been normalized. And normalization, once complete, is far more difficult to undo than violence ever is. In the end, what stayed with them was not fear of strangers. It was respect for thresholds, for the quiet power of letting someone in, and the equal power of knowing when to stop. The house stood unchanged to anyone who passed by, but inside it lived a lesson that would never fully leave. That evil does not always break down doors. Sometimes it waits for one to be opened, and when it is, it pays close attention to how long it is allowed to stay. By the time the final phase of the story took shape, nothing external marked its arrival. No message, no confirmation, no closure delivered from outside the house. Instead, it emerged internally, through the slow recognition that what had happened would never resolve into a clean narrative. There would be no moment where the couple could say, "This is where it ended." The ending had already dispersed, woven into how they now moved through the world. They noticed it first in conversation. When people spoke about crime in abstract terms, evil as something distant, monstrous, easy to identify, the couple remained quiet, not because they disagreed, but because they understood how misleading simplicity can be. Violence, they had learned, does not always rupture reality. Sometimes it fits into it. The man who had stayed with them had not shattered their routines, he had joined them. That distinction stayed with the couple longer than any fear. It forced them to confront a truth that felt deeply uncomfortable. The line between safety and danger is not always drawn by behavior, but by permission. Permission to stay, permission to speak, permission to be unexamined. They had given that permission gradually, without realizing how cumulative it could become. This awareness did not curdle into self-blame. Instead, it settled into responsibility. Not responsibility for what the man had done before arriving, that belonged to him alone, but responsibility for how easily they had adapted to his presence. Adaptation, they realized, is not always resilience. Sometimes it is accommodation. In quiet moments, they revisited early decisions. The choice not to ask more questions. The relief they felt when nothing bad happened right away. The way calm had been mistaken for safety. None of these moments felt wrong at the time. That was the problem. The couple understood now that harm often relies on the absence of friction, on politeness, on the shared desire to avoid discomfort. The man had never forced himself into their lives. He had waited for space to be offered. And it had been. This realization reshaped how they understood their own values. They still believed in compassion, but no longer believed compassion required silence. They learned that asking questions is not cruelty, and boundaries are not rejection. Boundaries are clarity. As time passed, the emotional intensity of the experience dulled, but the insight remained sharp. It surfaced in subtle ways, in how quickly they interrupted conversations that reframed violence as inevitability, in how carefully they listened when someone spoke about being misunderstood rather than accountable. They noticed patterns others overlooked, patterns they wished they had recognized sooner. The house itself felt different now, not haunted, not damaged, but aware. It no longer functioned as a neutral backdrop to their lives. It felt like a space that required intention. Doors were locked, not out of fear, but out of habit refined. Windows were checked. Guests were welcomed, but within structure. Structure had become a form of care. The couple never learned where the man ended up, whether he was caught, whether he disappeared entirely, whether he found another place willing to absorb him quietly. The absence of that knowledge was unsettling at first. Eventually, it became irrelevant. Knowing would not restore innocence. What mattered was that they no longer confused silence with peace. In later reflections, the couple agreed on one thing. The most frightening aspect of the encounter was not proximity to violence, but proximity to justification. The man had not demanded sympathy. He had not asked to be forgiven. He had simply spoken as though what he had done was understandable. Exhaustion, pressure, brokenness. These explanations had almost worked. Almost. The couple understood now that understanding harm is not the same as excusing it, and that listening when uncritical can become participation. This insight followed them quietly, shaping decisions they would never associate directly with that night. It altered how they raised concerns, how they evaluated risk, how they defined safety, not as the absence of threat but as the presence of accountability. The story, by this point, no longer belonged to the man. It belonged to the threshold, to the moment kindness meets consequence, to the realization that offering shelter is not a neutral act. It creates a relationship, however brief, and relationships carry weight. By the end of this phase, the couple no longer searched for meaning in what had happened. Meaning had already settled. Not as a lesson shouted loudly, but as a quiet rule they would carry forward. That care must be deliberate, that trust must be shaped, and that the most dangerous thing about violence is not always the act itself, but how easily it can sit down, accept help, and wait to see how much of itself you are willing to live alongside. And that understanding, once gained, does not leave. It simply becomes part of how you decide who gets to stay. The final understanding did not arrive all at once. It assembled itself slowly, through repetition, through absence, through the quiet way memory resurfaces when it is no longer invited. The couple did not sit down and decide what the experience had meant. Meaning emerged on its own, unannounced, as most lasting things do. They noticed it first in how they spoke to each other. Conversations carried fewer assumptions. Questions were asked earlier, more directly. Discomfort was no longer postponed in the name of politeness. This shift was not dramatic. It was practical. They had learned that silence, when prolonged, can become a kind of consent. The man had relied on that. Not through intimidation, not through force, through calm. The couple understood now that calm can be constructed, that composure is not proof of safety, and that patience, when paired with proximity, can function as pressure. This realization reframed the entire encounter. The danger had never been that he might hurt them suddenly. The danger had been that he might stay long enough to become normal, stay long enough to be defended, stay long enough for the idea of removal to feel unreasonable. They had come closer to that outcome than they were comfortable admitting. In the months that followed, the couple became more attentive to transitions, to moments when temporary arrangements begin to feel permanent without being acknowledged. They learned to name those moments aloud, to each other at least. Is this still temporary? Are we okay with this continuing? These questions became anchors, not accusatory, clarifying. They understood now that clarity, introduced early, prevents harm later. The man's presence had taught them something they never wanted to learn, that evil does not always arrive demanding space. Sometimes it waits for space to be offered, then occupies it quietly without resistance. And once occupied, it becomes harder to dislodge, not because it is powerful, but because it is familiar. That familiarity lingered the longest. Not fear, not anger, familiarity. It took time before the couple could sit in silence together without listening for something else, before stillness felt neutral again. Even then, the awareness remained, like a muscle that never fully relaxes once trained. They did not resent this change. They respected it. It had kept them safe without hardening them. From time to time they wondered whether the man remembered them. Whether he replayed his time in their house as a near miss, a rest stop, or simply another place that failed to stop him. These thoughts surfaced briefly, then faded. His memory no longer mattered. What mattered was what they carried forward. They did not turn their experience into a warning they shared publicly. Warnings invite spectacle, they invite simplification. What they had learned resisted both. It required nuance. It required restraint. It required listening carefully. The couple learned that harm does not always seek secrecy. Sometimes it seeks acceptance. Sometimes it waits to be treated as understandable rather than unforgivable. The man had never asked them to forgive him. He had only asked them not to look too closely. That request, they realized, had been the most dangerous one. In the end, what stayed with them was not the image of a killer in their home, but the image of a guest being allowed to linger without definition. The absence of definition had been the opening. They resolved never to leave such spaces unexamined again, not in their home, not in their relationships, not in their judgments of others. The story, as it lived within them, did not demand fear. It demanded awareness. By the time the final shape of the experience settled, the couple no longer framed it as something that had happened to them. They framed it as something they had moved through and emerged from with sharper edges, clearer sight, and fewer illusions. They had not stopped believing in kindness. They had stopped believing that kindness alone is enough. That belief, they understood now, belongs to people who have never had to test it. The house stood unchanged. The door still opened, but it opened with intention. And that intention, quiet, firm, and unnegotiable, was the final boundary the man would never have the chance to cross. Because the most important lesson he left behind was not about violence, it was about thresholds. And once thresholds are understood, they do not disappear. They wait, just like he had, for someone else, somewhere else, to decide how much they are willing to let inside. Stories like this rarely end with certainty. There is no moment when the couple receives confirmation that fully explains what they lived through, no message that resolves doubt, no final detail that transforms fear into relief. According to those who reflect on it later, the absence of confirmation became part of the meaning. What lingered was not the man himself, but the quiet realization of how close harm can come without announcing itself. The couple never questioned their instinct to help. That mattered to them. What changed was their understanding of what help requires. They learned that compassion without structure can become an invitation, and that silence, offered to avoid discomfort, can be mistaken for consent. The man did not force his way into their lives. He waited. He accepted what was offered. He adapted to what was allowed. And when the moment came, he left on his own terms. That choice, more than anything else, unsettled them, because it meant the outcome had never been inevitable. It had always depended on proximity, patience, and how long someone was willing to look away. The couple carried this knowledge quietly, not as fear, but as clarity. They learned that safety is not built by assuming the best, but by remaining willing to ask difficult questions early, before kindness becomes complicity. Their house remained just a house to anyone passing by, warm, ordinary, unremarkable. But inside, it lived a truth that would never fully fade, that violence does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives calm, sometimes it arrives wounded, and sometimes it sits at your table long enough for you to forget that it ever needed permission to be there. This story does not ask you to distrust strangers. It asks you to respect thresholds, to remember that letting someone in is an act that shapes what follows, and that the most dangerous moments are not always the loudest ones, but the quiet periods where nothing seems wrong, and yet something is waiting to see how much you will allow. The final chapter, then, is not about what the man did. It is about what the couple learned, that boundaries are not the opposite of compassion. They are what keep compassion from becoming a doorway harm can quietly walk through.